To say that the future of Confederate monuments is a challenging issue for Durham, as well as our neighbors throughout the Triangle, the state, and the nation would be an understatement. That's why Durham City County Committee on Confederate Monuments and Memorials was established last year, after the Confederate statue outside of the old courthouse was toppled. The committee is responsible for making recommendations about the future of the statue, as well as other public Confederate monuments and symbols in Durham. Given the climate right now, it's clear that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Welcome to City Life. I'm Beverly Thompson. Joining me to talk about the committee's work so far are co-chairs Charmaine McKissick-Melton and Robin Kirk. Welcome to you both, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So, Dr. McKissick-Melton, you are an associate professor of mass communication at NC Central University, and you have a PhD in communications with a focus on race relations, right?
Correct.
Okay, but that is not where your involvement in race relations actually began. I happen to know that personally. But tell our viewers a little bit about what your background entails.
Well, first, I'm the youngest daughter of the late Floyd McKissick Sr., first African-American to also sue the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, become the first African-American to attend the law school there in the 1950s with a few others of his friends. Also, he was a speaker at the March on Washington in 1963, a national civil rights leader with CORE, C-O-R-E, Congress on Racial Equality, and all of my siblings and myself were some of the guinea pigs of desegregation of Durham public schools. My older siblings back in 1959 with about, I think, 6 other kids. And then a little bit later, my brother and I, for elementary schools, Floyd was in the 6th grade, I was in the 3rd, so I was among the youngest to integrate Durham public schools. I will now only modify that to desegregate Durham public schools.
Okay, all right. Quite an extensive background and one that reaches a little bit far back, right?
Yeah.
So you've seen some things. And Robin, I know you're a faculty co-chair at the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. I want to get it right. Tell our audience a little bit about your background as well and where your interest in human rights actually started.
Well, I started in human rights as a journalist, and then I worked for many years with Human Rights Watch, covering Peru and Colombia. But I also became more and more interested in how human rights is seen and practiced here in the United States. And this committee gives the opportunity to think about that in terms of the way Durham deals with its past, the way Durham deals with civil rights, and how that's expressed in this discussion over the Confederate Memorial.
So let's talk about what you're actually charged to do. Charmaine, the City County Committee on Confederate Memorials and Monuments was established after the Confederate statue was toppled right outside of the old courthouse. Why did the city and the county believe that this committee was so necessary?
Actually, I got a phone call from Steve and discussing the fact that we're a little different in Durham. Someone actually pulled it down. And we now have, as I've been calling him, unfortunately, the crumpled one. So we're not in the same position as most other communities. We actually kind of need to deal with what happened to the thing that got torn down. So we do have some regulations based upon the state of North Carolina. Back in 2015, Governor McCrory kind of helped institute a policy. So we have some parameters, but our statue is different, and even as we've noticed in the last few weeks with Silent Sam coming down, and I went down to Greater Carolina too, that he came down in one solid piece. And the one we had in front of Durham's courthouse, they didn't have the money, so he was hollow, which is why he's now a crumpled piece of mess. So yeah, I think we had a different and unique circumstance, and I think they felt there was a unique and a different way to deal with it and to hear from voices in the community to figure out what do we do.
So Charmaine referenced what happened in Chapel Hill, Robin, and I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the climate of how things are now insofar as this whole issue needing to be addressed?
Well, I think that's really the key point, how it's being addressed. And I think for Durham, and I would just second what Charmaine said about Durham being different, I would also say that Durham is a place where I think people can have a conversation about this, and that's what's missing when some people take a unilateral decision to deface or destroy a monument. There's no discussion. There's no education about what that monument means, where it came from, how it even got to be here. Most people don't even know the process by which the monument was erected. And so this is a really important thing for us to be able to have that conversation with a lot of different people and not only allow people to speak their opinions about it, but also do some education, like what is it we're talking about historically, and how did the statue come to be? And there are some unique circumstances about the Durham statue. For instance, one is that the charitable organizations that fundraised for it, the Sons of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the Confederacy, weren't able to raise enough money to pay for the statue outright. So a tax was levied, a one-time tax was levied to pay for it, which means in effect that a fair number of African Americans who at the time could not really vote were forced to pay a tax for a monument they may or may not have supported. So I think that's different from Silent Sam, which was paid for by charitable donations. So it's, I think there's a lot of deep history here about the way Durham was formed after the Civil War, the fact that the African American community has such an important role in Durham, not only living here, but being an important economic force here with Black Wall Street. And so I think for Charmaine and I, the opportunity to have this conversation is really important.
So it's also totally educational for the community overall. So I think that's a great thing, for the enlightenment of everybody. Now, I know there are 10 members on the committee in addition to yourselves, and you both were selected by Mayor Schul. So how were the Mayor Schul and County Commissioner Wendy Jacobs, right? I didn't mean to leave her off. But how were the other members selected?
Well, there were. It was open to the public. So 5 people were selected from the city and 5 were selected from the county. Our only suggestion was that it be as diverse as possible in terms of gender, age, race, all those things. And I think they did a pretty good job.
Wow, that's good. Okay. So moving on then, I know they came from a variety of backgrounds. Do you believe it represents, I know you just said you did, you believe they represent a fair representation of the community?
I think so. We have, just to name a couple of people, we have 2 quite young members who are in their 20s. We have someone who is a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. We have someone who's very involved in city planning and county planning. We have a preservationist. We have a folklorist. We have several historians. And the one thing that unites us is we all are, care deeply about Durham and have histories here in Durham. So this is not just about the statue, it's also about how we want to think about our community and the fact that we all have a stake here in Durham. So we want to have a process that brings people together. We may not all agree on what we're going to do, but at least we'll have had this conversation and know why other people think the way they do and the passions. I mean, there are very deep passions about this subject, and we also want to have a place for that in our meetings.
So they do have varying viewpoints, and I think that's a great thing for this group to have on such a really sensitive issue. So what are the committee's primary responsibilities?
Well, I usually read, 5 charges every night to make sure everyone hears the exact same thing. And one of the points that we like to make at the top of any of our meetings is that we are really not here. Our charge is not to discuss the rights or the wrongs of the statue coming down.
Okay.
It is really forward-looking. And so certainly to find any remnants of the Confederacy that's left in the city of Durham and the county, all of Durham County. Also to perhaps make recommendations on things that are missing from the historic nature of Durham. I'm missing one, Robin. Help me out.
Let's see. Well, to have a conversation, to engage the public. That's a big part of our mission so that's why we've had meetings all over the county. We had one recently at the Rougemont Ruritan Club, which was a great night. We had a lot of engagement. We have been working with Durham Extension to have facilitators come to help us make every meeting productive. And then we've had meetings both in the county chambers and the city council chambers, kind of a little bit more formal, where the public is invited to come and speak. We also have a speaker at every meeting to give us some of that education, to give us some of that background. So for instance, the North Carolina room of the Durham County Library came last time. We had someone speak who had been an archivist with the Museum of the Confederacy and was a member of the Daughters of the Confederacy. We've had a historian speak from UNC, Fitz Brundage. We had School of Government speaker the very first time to talk about the law, the state law about what's called public objects of remembrance. So.
And we also had a speaker that dealt with the concept of the African American population post-Civil War, in particular Black Wall Street. So we've had a number of diverse speakers in the mix, and I think when we started talking about how to structure these meetings, key to us was to make sure it was as transparent as possible and to have as many diverse voices heard as possible. We don't always agree with everyone, and that's not really the charge here. It's to hear those voices, and then particularly with the facilitated meetings, with having the sort of focus group facilitated discussion, we're able to capture all of that on paper with those facilitators. So when we get to the end of this process, it's not just all this verbal stuff that's in our brain. We've really got something on paper to see, well, how many people thought this way, that way. And then, of course, the meetings that are in city council and county chambers, those are open for public comment.
Okay. So just to clarify then, I think everybody's wondering, is this committee just to decide the future of the monuments, whether they should be removed, or stay in place? Or is it to decide what to do with them if they are removed, or both?
I think it's all of the above, and that makes some other recommendations too that are not specifically related to the statue. So yes, what to do with the base, because it's still there. Right. What to do with the crumpled one, as I continue to call them. And then, of course, when they've added the charge about the additional remembrances, then that's a whole nother list of not only of those things that are missing from Durham's history, persons, ideas, places, things, but also the other charge of making sure that we get it right in terms of making sure that the diverse voices are heard in terms of how they want to represent this designation in the future. We've heard all sorts of ideas of what to do with through these meetings. Some are probably not suitable for me to even say out loud. Right. Absolutely. And then there are others who have, there are people, one guy a couple of weeks ago said, let's just melt it all down and make it into something else that was a person of significance in the city of Durham. They didn't have anyone in particular in mind. There are others who've, I think a few meetings ago, someone said, let's take the statue as is, put it back on the base, and then put another sign that contextualizes the situation. How it got there from the very beginning, why it was torn down, and why we decided to put it back and say how it all happened. So there's so many different, of course, there's, like I said, there's a bunch of others that don't range anywhere being nice about it, but that's just an example of, so we'll see. I think our goal is to make recommendations. Now what the city and the county choose to do, we shall see. Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you vet all of that information? Because you're getting so many different viewpoints. I mean, how do you prioritize or rank or say, definitely we can't do that? But how do you go about doing that?
Well, I think that's certainly something the committee has been and will be talking about. Like, how do we come to some sort of if not a complete consensus, like how do we come up with some recommendations that are helpful to the county and to the city? We don't pretend that we're going to have the answers for everything, but I think everyone can be very confident that we have done the best possible job of collecting opinion and of considering it within the confines of what we think the county and the city are actually able to do, because there is that law that while we're not bound by that law in terms of our recommendations, we certainly have to take it into account as a political matter. There are certain constraints on what our elected representatives can do, but what we really want also is to show the public and to show the elected representatives a variety of opinions and the fact that this really has been a transparent process where people have been able to voice their opinion, both if they've come personally to a meeting, that we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter feed, we can receive email, we can receive actual old-fashioned written mail. People stop me in the street all the time and say something about it. And we try to make sure that every committee member has this information. You can look on our Facebook page and all of our meetings are there and stuff, so that we can come together as a committee and say, look, we have all this information now. How can we best help Durham move forward?
So do you feel confident that you've reached a majority of the public?
Well, I think
or a good number.
A good number by the time we get through with our meetings. We had to cancel one because of the Hurricane Florence, but maybe we can make it up. We're not sure within the time frame. But I just wanted to piggyback on one of the things that Robin said. Because our committee is so diverse, I think we've all sort of almost figured out that we may not come to a unanimous decision. And that's okay, I think. Our goal was to make recommendations. But does not necessarily mean everyone in the committee is going to agree with every recommendation that's being made. But to throw as many, I think we may get consensus, and that may be the goal in having a person that's worked on the citywide site-based committee here for schools and on Githin's school board where site-based decision-making was based upon consensus and strongly encouraged. I actually feel good about that process. I don't think we need a majority rule necessarily to move forward on some ideas that perhaps the majority or the consensus of the group has decided are forward-looking things for the city and the county of Durham.
So do you feel confident, too, that the feedback you've been given represents everybody and their opinions are something that you can go forth with in terms of, you know, the rationale behind them giving you certain feedback?
I do feel like we will have a really good sense of what, especially what the people who care about this issue think. And I think, you know, at a time when Durham is changing so much and we're having so many new people come, what's really exciting, and we always include this in our facilitated meetings, what's really exciting is when you ask people, which is also part of our charge, you know, what sort of historical sites should we have? Like, we have this, and that's fine and dandy. But now that we're kind of opening the discussion for other sites, what are we missing? Who can we celebrate? And the people actually start to get really excited about that. Oh, well, there's this person, or there's this group. They love that question. And that immediately then kind of takes the focus off of this kind of clash over this one monument and says, look, we have an incredibly rich, interesting history. Why don't we, as part of our growth as a city, as part of our recognition of who built this city, how can we be creative about new sites that honor that past? And I think that really gets people going.
And, you know, it's intriguing that that's future thinking. Building on the history, but thinking about the future. That's really nice.
So we've had diverse forces. I mean, there was one meeting where I encountered a young man who had a Confederate flag on the front and a huge one on the back with the classic expression, you know, it's not about race, it's about history. And it was engaging. I encouraged him to stay, and after he put his...
And he did.
He did. He ended up eventually staying, and I'm not sure he was ever thrilled with myself or the facilitator, but that's okay. We got him to stay, and his point of view was heard. I think he felt good about that.
That's good. And that's the great thing, I think, about this committee, is giving people an outlet to voice their own opinion. So, what do you think you've accomplished so far toward being able to make a recommendation to the mayor and to Commissioner Jacobs?
Well, we know we've already discussed, like, street names doesn't really seem to be in the category. We kind of talked about buildings within the county. We think most of them have either been modified, changed, or don't exist. So right now, it would, and we're not going to deal with the cemeteries because we do have some things in Beechwood and Maplewood. But that's not an area that the committee as a whole thinks that we should even think about dealing with. So we were putting a list together, and it continues to grow as to those remnants of the Confederacy that are left, and also a list of all these people that folks think need to be, that are missing from Durham's history. So some are actual individuals, and some are global, like, well, I think the last meeting, I think the entire table, one table I was at, agreed upon the tobacco workers of the city of Durham. So I was like, okay, and yet we had a real diverse group of people at the table, but they came up with one they could all agree upon. So the process may be a little difficult upon occasion, but I think...
But you knew it would be.
Yeah, I think we knew there's going to be opinions that were quite passionate on both sides of the, on all sides, I should say, of the issue. So, but that's really kind of what we encourage. So that we get to the end, it was really kind of a nice feeling that everybody at the table with all these diverse perspectives, ages, ranges, you name it, actually did come up with something that they could agree upon.
So what's going to happen with recommendations once you present them to the mayor and Commissioner Jacobs?
Well, we currently have our last meeting for public comment will be October 11th. And then we will have a working meeting of the committee to sit down and kind of go through some of this stuff. And we will be hopefully working with the city and the county to decide when would be the best moment to, and how long it takes us to come to kind of some sort of a report. It won't be a long, I don't think it'll be a long report, but it will be sort of summarizing all the material that we've gone over and then making these recommendations. I think the other thing is we have been archiving all of our proceedings, all of the material that we've generated, and we're going to be depositing that with the North Carolina room. So all of that stuff will also be available for people to look at if they want, like all our flip charts from these facilitated meetings. So we, as I said, we want to keep this totally transparent. So if people have questions about it, they can look, they can talk to us, they can engage with us. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the city and the county to decide what to do with our recommendations. And I think that's proper. They're elected. You know, we're not elected. We were just appointed. So ultimately, it will be up to them to say what's useful or what's not useful about our report.
Do we know how many monuments or memorials we're actually talking about here in Durham?
Well, we think, as far as we've been able to tell in the county, really the only one that would qualify as a remnant of the Confederacy is currently the base in front of the old courthouse.
And Bennettsville,
and Bennett Place, but Bennett Place has
that's different.
Its monument is devoted to peace as opposed to the Confederacy, and there is a difference. And it really is interesting to compare Bennett Place to that monument because the people, and including the board of directors of Bennett Place, they're very clear that their site is not about one side in the Civil War. It's about the end of the war. And that's a very different and that's a very different thing. So really, we only have the Confederate monument base and the former statue. There is, there's also an open question about the state highway marker to Julian Carr, which is on Chapel Hill Street. And I think, but that's a little bit different, and we've talked about it some, but it's different because Julian Carr was more than his Confederate service. He was also obviously an industrialist, someone who helped build Durham, and so we still haven't kind of come to a conclusion about that particular site because it is more complicated than just the Confederacy, but clearly the base of the former statue and the statue itself are really the focus of our report.
And the other issue with the street sign is, all the changes in maps and the city, and it's way more complicated than just changing a sign on a street. So the committee talked about it. I guess we'll come back to it when we get in our work session, perhaps. But there's so many other issues about that we need to deal with that seem sort of second, third theory to the real charge.
How many more meetings do you have? After
we have two more meetings. Two more meetings that for public comment, and then we'll have one third working meeting.
So the October 11th meeting, that will be in City Council chambers in City Hall. At 7 p.m. Most of them start at 7. Occasionally we have a speaker or something we need to modify.
So this committee is one thing that makes you feel good about what Durham is and shows Durham kind of leading the way, in my opinion. What do you, or do you know if other cities are doing anything similar to this? Either one.
Well, both. We've looked at other places across the country. They don't have the legal parameters that we do. So I think it was Easter of last year that I was in New Orleans, and in the Thief of Night, they took some away. Literally while I was there. And so some cities have chosen to, it states. But we've got a few parameters. So that's in the state of North Carolina, period, because of the 2015 McCrory ruling. So otherwise, I mean, we could talk about places across the country.
I mean, Richmond had a somewhat of a similar process. Baltimore, but I do think that I would commend the city and the county for making this a citizen-based process, and I think that is somewhat unusual. But again, as Charmaine said at the beginning, we have a slightly different set of circumstances because the Durham monument was damaged, and so there's a real question about how we interpret the North Carolina law when you have a site that's been damaged. The law really doesn't speak to that. So I'm not saying that it can't be applied. It's just like we don't know. It could be applied, but maybe not. So. So we are kind of sui generis in a couple of ways, and one is the fact that the statue itself was taken down. So.
Okay. So when is the committee supposed to wrap up its work?
Probably before the end of the year.
Before the end of the year.
That's our goal.
Okay.
You know, we never know in the state of North Carolina where we may have another natural something that we have to deal with, especially in the middle of hurricane season. But yeah, we were hoping maybe by the end of the year. So.
Yeah, and I have to ask you both a personal question. How does it make you feel being a part of this project and being so involved, especially with both of your histories?
On the days where we have meetings, I'll be honest, it's a little difficult. One, my phone starts buzzing and ringing in the media, and I teach media. So sometimes there are teachable moments in my classroom related to it. Then it's constant. I actually didn't think it'd be quite as much work, but I'll give my co-chair a lot of credit for, we kind of take different parts of the assignment down the middle. So she does a lot of the email stuff that I can spend time not doing, and I do a lot of more of the helping with the focus groups, I guess, a little bit sometimes. And sometimes it makes a difference as to how you say something to an individual or so forth. So we'll look at each other and kind of know, because we've actually worked together on other things in the past, and including the Greensboro reconciliation piece many years ago when I was at Bennett College. So we've known each other a little while, which also makes this process much easier.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier that we kind of know each other. So when we started, it wasn't learning, it was hi, how you doing? Good, and we've done this kind of thing before. But yeah, I'm hopeful that the community will be. At the end of the last meeting, a lot of people actually said, "Thank you so much for doing this," and that was nice.
That's great.
That was a good feeling. So let's hope that's what most of the community feels.
How about you, Robin?
It's a great question. I think, you know, not to dwell on this, but I think we are in a moment where it seems like a lot of people are screaming at each other.
Right.
Both, you know, maybe locally, but especially nationally. And even though this is such a difficult subject and people come to it with very strong opinions, that has not been our experience in the meetings. People have come maybe not knowing how it's going to go, but people have engaged, I would say, with kind of an open mind. And it's been very heartening, at least for me, to see people come and also start to learn things, and also that what's also fascinating is start to talk to each other. And I know that sounds cliched, but it is something, you can't be snarky to someone face to face like you can on Facebook. And when people are forced to look at each other and listen to each other, even though they may disagree deeply, and then kind of engage with someone after the meeting is done and, you know, say hello, or, you know, I thought that was an interesting point. I've learned a tremendous amount from this process. So that for me has been a real value.
And I think, you know, part of the civil rights movement is always Dr. King, my father of many, you know, without dialogue, there really is no social change.
Right.
And yeah, we've just been, a lot of this country right now is just shouting at each other and no one's listening. And so it has been very heartening, as you said, to actually, sometimes it gets a little passionate around the tables, but when the time is over, it is good to see that people, no one gets up and walks out in frustration. People stay for that hour and a half and actually pour out their hearts and souls out about how they feel. And so it's cathartic, I think, for whoever is there, that they've gotten their opinion across.
Do they get emotional?
They do. They do. They do.
On both sides.
This has to do with family memories, how you were taught, what were you taught to value, things that hurt you in your growing up, you know, whether it's racism or sexism or whatever. And if you feel like that's represented by the statue, a lot of this can be very hurtful. And then to have, you know, those that believe in these statues, you know, it's not something superficial. It's something that goes back into their own family histories and what they've been taught. So I have to respect, you know, whatever position someone is coming from. But the fact that they're coming to the table and saying, okay, I want to take part in this discussion, you know, a couple of committee members have come up to me, you know, during the course of a meeting or something and just say, you know, I didn't really get it, but now I do. This is a really important conversation. Beyond what may ultimately happen with the monument, it's like we've had this conversation, and this has made me kind of think a different way about this community.
So if people want to get involved still, what do they need to do?
Well, we have a Facebook page, and that's where our events are, so you can see and come to our next event here in the City Council chambers on October 11th. You can write us on Facebook. You can send us a tweet. You can write us an email. And all of that information is on the Facebook page. Or you can call up the city or county and get it. You can write us a letter via the county or city. So we're eager to. Anyone who wants to opine is welcome.
And just to echo that all of that information is captured too, so when we sit down and go through it all, it's not just what's Facebook and just what was in public comment or just so we'll be looking at all of that to see where the balance is of what the Durham community really thinks.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're out of time, but I really believe we have the two best people in Durham to head this committee. And it's just amazing the synergy that you two have. And thank you so much for doing your work, and thank you for joining me to talk about it. I feel really blessed.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Well, that does it for City Life. Don't forget to follow us on social media, watch us on the Durham Television Network and on YouTube, and listen to our podcast on iTunes. I'm Beverly Thompson. Thank you for joining me to learn more about City Life in Durham.